Everyone expected the ruthless head of the Costello syndicate to bring a disposable supermodel to the wedding of the decade. But when Dominic Costello walked into the grand ballroom of Oheka Castle, the woman on his arm didn't just turn heads, she made the bride drop her champagne glass. The wedding invitation was heavy, crafted from triple-thick cream cardstock, with edges dipped in 24-karat gold leaf. It rested on the mahogany expanse of Dominic Costello's desk like a threat. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Sterling request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Beatrice Ann, to Mr. Leonardo Costello. Dominic poured himself a measure of Macallan, the amber liquid catching the muted glow of the Manhattan skyline outside his penthouse window. Leo, his younger brother, was the golden child. Dominic had spent his entire adult life keeping Leo completely insulated from the family's true business. Leo was sent to Exeter, then Harvard Law, groomed for legitimacy. Now, he was marrying into the Sterlings, one of New York's oldest, most insufferably aristocratic families. "They don't want you there, Dom," Vincent said from the shadows of the office. Vincent was Dominic's underboss, a man whose tailored Brioni suits barely hid the violence in his frame. "Richard Sterling only approved the marriage because you handed him $40 million in clean offshore capital to save his failing logistics empire. He took your money, but he still thinks he's better than you. The guest list is packed with federal judges, Senator Charles Hastings, and half the Manhattan District Attorney's office. It's a trap." "I know what it is, Vince," Dominic murmured, tracing the embossed lettering of the invitation. "It's a flex. Sterling wants to parade his new son-in-law around the Hamptons crowd, while forcing me to sit in the corner like a feral dog they've graciously allowed indoors. He's betting I won't show up to avoid the police presence, which gives him the power to tell Leo his brother doesn't care. So, what's the play? You bring one of those Instagram models and let them sneer?" "No," Dominic said, his dark eyes hardening. "I don't play their game. I change the board. I need a date who doesn't just belong in their world. I need one who terrifies them." Dominic knew exactly who he was looking for. To find her, he had to leave the glittering heights of his penthouse and descend into the city's underbelly. Genevieve Croft was a ghost. 3 years ago, she had been the brilliant, ruthless chief financial officer of Sterling Enterprises. At 28, she was a prodigy in the financial district, widely known for her lethal intellect. But when the SEC swooped in to investigate a massive embezzlement scheme that Richard Sterling had orchestrated to cover his gambling debts and failing assets, the Sterling family needed a scapegoat. With the help of high-priced lawyers and fabricated evidence, they pinned the entire $80 million deficit on Genevieve. Judge Sullivan, a friend of the Sterlings from the Montauk Yacht Club circuit, had handed her a brutal 2-year sentence at Danbury Federal Correctional Institution. She had lost her license, her reputation, and her entire life. When she was released 6 months ago, she vanished from polite society. Dominic tracked her down to a high-stakes, illegal underground poker room in a soundproofed basement beneath a meatpacking district warehouse. She wasn't playing. She was running the books for a Russian syndicate, using her genius to launder millions through shell corporations. When Dominic walked into the back room, his reputation preceded him. The 2 heavily armed Russian guards instinctively stepped back. Genevieve didn't even look up from her dual monitors. She was striking, though the prison stint had sharpened her features into something cold and predatory. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe knot, and her eyes, when she finally looked at him, were the color of winter ice. "I don't work with the Italian faction, Mr. Costello," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of fear. "My arrangement with the Volkovs is exclusive." "I'm not here for your accounting skills, Genevieve," Dominic said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "I'm here to offer you an invitation." He slid the gold-embossed envelope across the metal desk. Genevieve's eyes flicked down. For a fraction of a second, the ice cracked, revealing a deep, volcanic hatred. But she quickly masked it. "Beatrice and Leo," she read softly. "How poetic. The mob prince and the society princess. What does this have to do with me? Leo is my brother. The Sterlings think they have me backed into a corner," Dominic explained, leaning forward. "Richard Sterling destroyed your life to save his own skin. He sits in his penthouse, playing the noble patriarch, while you rot down here balancing ledgers for thugs." I need a date for Saturday night. Someone who knows which fork to use at a five-star dinner. And someone who will make Richard Sterling's heart stop the second she walks into the room." Genevieve stared at him. "You want to weaponize me?" "I want to give you the stage you were violently thrown off of," Dominic corrected. "I'll pay you $100,000 for 3 hours of your time, and I guarantee you, the look on Richard's face will be worth 10 times that." A slow, dangerous smile curved Genevieve's lips. It was a smile that made even a seasoned killer like Dominic feel a sudden jolt of electricity. "Keep the money, Dominic." "But you're buying my dress." The preparation was an exercise in calculated warfare. Dominic spared no expense, treating Genevieve's transformation not as a makeover, but as the arming of a nuclear warhead. He booked the penthouse suite at the Baccarat Hotel, bringing in the most exclusive stylists in the city. He didn't want her looking like a victim who had scraped herself off the pavement. He wanted her looking like a queen returning to conquer her stolen kingdom. When Dominic arrived at the hotel on Saturday evening, he stood in the foyer of the suite, adjusting the cuffs of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. The bedroom door opened, and the air physically left his lungs. Genevieve stepped out. She was wearing an archival Alexander McQueen gown in a shade of red so deep it bordered on the color of freshly spilled blood. It was silk and structured, clinging to her curves before falling into a dramatic, sweeping train. The dress was a masterpiece of lethal elegance, but it was the way she wore it, her spine steel straight, her chin tipped in absolute defiance, that made her devastating. Her dark hair fell in soft, classic waves reminiscent of old Hollywood, and a slash of deep red lipstick completed the look. Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside rested a vintage Cartier diamond necklace, a spectacular arrangement of flawless stones that had once belonged to European royalty. "Turn around," he murmured, his voice noticeably thicker than usual. Genevieve complied, sweeping her hair over one shoulder. As Dominic stepped behind her, the proximity sent a spark of tension between them. He fastened the clasp, his knuckles brushing against the warm, bare skin of her neck. He felt her breath hitch slightly, betraying that beneath her icy exterior, she was as affected by him as he was by her. "They won't know what hit them," Dominic whispered, his breath ghosting over her skin. "That," Genevieve replied, turning to face him, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, burning intelligence, "is the entire point." The drive to Oaxaca Castle in Huntington, New York, was a quiet affair, but the silence inside the armored Maybach was electric. The sprawling, French-style chateau was the pinnacle of Long Island luxury, surrounded by manicured gardens and reflecting pools. The driveway was clogged with Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and the flashing cameras of high-society photographers. Dominic's security detail, a group of quiet men with distinct bulges under their tailored jackets, secured the perimeter before the Maybach's doors even opened. In the distance, an unmarked black sedan was parked FBI surveillance, taking down the license plates of every known associate. Dominic ignored them. He stepped out of the vehicle, the flashbulbs immediately erupting as the press recognized the city's most powerful organized crime figure daring to show his face at the society event of the year. Then, Dominic turned and offered his hand. When Genevieve emerged from the car, a sudden hush fell over the immediate crowd of onlookers. It wasn't just her staggering beauty. It was the air of absolute authority she carried. She slipped her arm through Dominic's, the contrast between his dark, imposing presence and her blazing red elegance, making them look like gods of the underworld, ascending to Olympus. They walked up the grand staircase and approached the entrance of the main ballroom. The reception was already in full swing. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the 300 guests sipping vintage Dom Perignon. Mindy Weiss, the legendary wedding planner, had transformed the space into a floral wonderland of white orchids and dripping wisteria. The room was a sea of pastel silks, diamonds, and conservative black tie elegance. A string quartet was playing a soft, classical piece, and the ambient noise was a low hum of wealthy, cultured conversation. Dominic and Genevieve stepped into the archway. It started with a whisper near the door. A socialite in a pale blue gown gasped, grabbing her husband's arm. Then, the silence began to spread. It rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave, a physical phenomenon that commanded the room's attention. The clinking of glasses slowed. The murmur of conversation died down until the only sound was the oblivious string quartet playing in the corner. Dominic felt a fierce surge of pride as he walked Genevieve down the main aisle of the ballroom, heading straight for the head table. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She looked directly ahead, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of people who had abandoned her, shunned her, and left her to take the fall. At the head table, Leo Costello stood up, a massive smile breaking out on his face at the sight of his older brother. But beside him, the bride, Beatrice Sterling, froze. She was holding a crystal champagne flute halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. Next to Beatrice sat her father, Richard Sterling. He was deep in conversation with Senator Hastings. As the unnatural silence of the room finally caught his attention, Richard turned his head. His eyes locked onto Genevieve. The color instantly drained from Richard Sterling's face, leaving him a sickening, ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave he had dug himself. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Beatrice's hand began to tremble. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, resounding crash that shattered the silence of the room. Dominic paused just a few feet from the head table. He smiled a cold, terrifying smile that promised absolute ruin. "Good evening, Richard," Dominic said smoothly, his voice carrying effortlessly in the dead quiet room. "I hope you don't mind. I brought a +1. The shattered crystal of Beatrice Sterling's champagne flute lay glittering on the marble floor, a jagged constellation mirroring the sudden fracture in the room's pristine atmosphere. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The string quartet in the corner, oblivious to the high society tectonic plates shifting, continued to scrape out a cheerful Vivaldi concerto. Leonardo Costello, blissfully ignorant of the blood feud simmering beneath the floral arrangements, broke the silence. He stepped around his paralyzed bride, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. Leo was the golden boy, possessing none of Dominic's dark, sharp edges. He wore his custom Brioni tuxedo with the effortless grace of a man who had never had to look over his shoulder. "Dom, I didn't think you were actually going to make it," Leo said, pulling his older brother into a fierce embrace. "I wouldn't miss my little brother's wedding," Dominic replied, his voice a low, soothing rumble that completely contradicted the predatory gleam in his dark eyes. He patted Leo's back, his gaze never leaving Richard Sterling's ashen face. Leo pulled back, his eyes finally landing on the woman standing beside Dominic. His polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second, entirely disarmed by the sheer, arresting power of Genevieve's presence. The blood-red Alexander McQueen gown seemed to absorb the light in the room, making her the undeniable focal point. "And you must be," Leo started, extending a hand. Genevieve didn't just shake his hand. She took it with the poised, terrifying grace of a reigning monarch greeting a foreign dignitary. "Genevieve," she said smoothly, her voice a rich, dark velvet that carried perfectly across the dead quiet head table. "Your brother was kind enough to invite me. I understand I'm something of a surprise." "A wonderful one," Leo said, charmingly oblivious. He turned to his new father-in-law. "Richard, did you know Dom was bringing a guest?" Richard Sterling looked as though he were actively having a stroke. The patriarch of the Sterling family, a man who usually commanded boardrooms with an iron fist and a booming, patrician voice, was reduced to a hyperventilating shell. He gripped the edge of the linen-draped table, his knuckles bone white. He opened his mouth, but only a raspy, unintelligible sound emerged. Beside him, Beatrice finally found her voice. "What is she doing here?" The bride's voice was a shrill, hysterical whisper. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the prominent guests. District Attorney Robert Kensington was already whispering furiously to his wife, while Victoria Montgomery, the undisputed queen of Upper East Side gossip, was staring with a look of ravenous hunger. "Daddy, what is she doing here?" Dominic stepped forward, smoothly placing a hand on the small of Genevieve's back. The proprietary gesture was not lost on anyone in the room. "Genevieve is my +1, Beatrice. I assure you, We are just here to celebrate." Dominic's smile was razor thin. "Isn't that right, Richard? It's a night for family." "Security," Richard finally choked out, his voice barely a croak. "Someone call security. Now, Richard." Senator Charles Hastings interrupted, leaning over from 2 seats down. The senator was a political shark, and he smelled blood in the water. "Let's not make a scene. It's your daughter's wedding, and Mr. Costello is a significant contributor to the evening." Hastings shot Dominic a calculated look, fully aware of the $40 million of Costello money keeping the Sterling Empire afloat. Genevieve took a deliberate step forward. The Cartier diamonds at her throat caught the light of the chandeliers, flashing with cold, hard fire. "Please, Richard, don't cause a fuss on my account," she purred, her eyes locking onto his. "I would hate for the authorities to be called. We all know how messy it gets when the police start looking into things. Offshore accounts, Cayman Island routing numbers, suddenly unsealed documents. It can be so taxing on a man of your age." The threat was delivered with a smile so polite, it was sociopathic. Richard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just reminding him of the past. She was threatening him with the present. "Sit down," Richard hissed to Beatrice, aggressively yanking his daughter by the wrist. "Say nothing. Do nothing." Dominic pulled out a chair for Genevieve at the table, directly across from Richard. As she sat, the surrounding tables erupted into a furious, suppressed murmuring. The whispers traveled like a contagion. "Is that? It can't be. She's in federal prison. That's Genevieve Croft, the Sterling CFO, who embezzled $80 million. Why is she with Dominic Costello? The mob brought a white-collar felon to a society wedding? Dinner was an excruciating psychological warfare, disguised as a 5-course culinary masterpiece. Mindy Weiss had arranged for a menu of butter-poached lobster and Wagyu beef, but at the head table, the food went untouched. Genevieve, however, ate with delicate, unbothered precision. She engaged Senator Hastings in a highly technical conversation regarding the SEC's new oversight regulations on shell corporations. Every word out of her mouth was a meticulously crafted dart aimed directly at Richard Sterling's fragile sanity. "The problem, Senator," Genevieve said, taking a tiny sip of her water, "is that the current loopholes allow corrupt board members to shift liabilities onto their subordinates. It takes a truly cowardly man to build a fortune on the backs of others, don't you think?" "Indeed," Hastings chuckled nervously, glancing at Richard, who was currently staring at his plate with hollow, bloodshot eyes. "A very astute observation, Miss Croft. I had heard you were brilliant. It's a shame about your recent sabbatical." "A minor detour," Genevieve smiled, her eyes flickering to Dominic. "I found the time away incredibly clarifying. It allowed me to see exactly who my friends are, and, more importantly, who my enemies are." Dominic sat beside her, radiating quiet, lethal power. He didn't need to speak. His mere presence, the notorious boss of the Costello family acting as the shield for society's most hated pariah, was enough to keep everyone paralyzed. He watched Genevieve with a mixture of dark amusement and profound fascination. She was a maestro, conducting a symphony of panic, and he had given her the baton. As the waiters cleared the plates for dessert, Richard Sterling suddenly stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floor. "Costello," Richard snapped, abandoning all pretense of civility. "A word. In private. Now." Dominic slowly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, deliberately taking his time. He looked at Genevieve, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Dominic stood, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. "Excuse us," Dominic said smoothly to the table. He followed Richard out of the ballroom, down a long, dimly lit corridor, lined with Renaissance oil paintings, and into the estate's private mahogany-paneled library. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Richard whirled around, his face purple with rage. "Are you out of your mind?" Richard roared, abandoning the polished aristocrat persona completely. "You bring that bitch to my daughter's wedding? Do you know who was in that room? The district attorney, 2 federal judges. You are trying to destroy me." "You destroyed yourself, Richard," Dominic said coldly, stepping further into the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You took my 40 million to save your failing company. You smiled in my face and took my money. And then you tried to embarrass me by inviting me to a room full of people who want me dead or in a cell, betting I wouldn't have the spine to show up. This is about pride? Richard spat. You resurrected Genevieve Croft for a stunt? I brought her because she is a reminder. Dominic stepped closer, towering over the older man. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A reminder that you are not untouchable, Richard. You framed a 28-year-old woman, sent her to federal prison, and ruined her life so you could keep playing golf in Montauk. You think you're better than me because my family's money was made on the streets, while yours was made in boardrooms? You're a coward, Richard. I just brought the ghost of your cowardice to dinner. She's a convicted felon. And what are you? Dominic countered softly. If the DA out there knew exactly where that 80 million actually went and who signed the transfer orders, you wouldn't be wearing a tuxedo right now. You'd be wearing an orange jumpsuit. Richard visibly deflated, stumbling back against the edge of a leather sofa. What do you want, Costello? More money? A seat on the board? Name your price and get her out of my house. I don't want anything, Dominic said, turning his back and walking toward the door. This was Genevieve's night. I'm Joder Escort. If you have a problem, you negotiate with her. When Dominic returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted from shocked silence to a chaotic, buzzing tension. The band had transitioned from classical music to a slow, sultry jazz number, signaling the opening of the dance floor. Leo and Beatrice were dutifully swaying in the center, though Beatrice looked as though she were marching to the gallows. Dominic found Genevieve standing near the towering French doors that opened onto the terrace. She was looking out into the night, the red silk of her dress billowing slightly in the evening breeze. Did he cry? She asked without turning around, sensing his approach. Not quite, but he's close, Dominic said, stopping beside her. He offered his arm. The music is playing. It would be a shame to waste the dress. Genevieve turned, her icy eyes scanning his face. Slowly, a genuine, dangerous smile touched her lips. She slipped her hand into his, and he led her onto the polished wood of the dance floor. As they stepped into the light, the crowd instinctively parted for them. Dominic pulled her close, his hand resting firmly on the bare dip of her spine. Genevieve's hand slid up to rest on his shoulder. They moved flawlessly together, their physical chemistry undeniable. The contrast of his dark, dangerous aura and her blazing, untouchable elegance made them the most captivating, terrifying couple in the room. You enjoyed that? Dominic murmured, his lips brushing dangerously close to her ear. Every second, she breathed back, her body molding perfectly to his lead. But did you really think I came here just to ruin his dinner, Dominic? Dominic pulled back slightly, looking down into her eyes. There was something swirling in those depths, something much deeper and far more violent than simple revenge for a ruined reputation. What are you playing at, Jen? You think Richard framed me just to cover his debts? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the jazz band. You think he's just a coward. He's much worse. While I was in Danbury, there was an incident, a riot in the mess hall. Dominic's grip on her waist tightened instinctively. Go on. A woman came at me with a sharpened toothbrush handle, missed my jugular by half an inch. Genevieve's eyes were cold, dead. I paid a guard $5,000 to find out who ordered it. It wasn't random, Dominic. Richard Sterling didn't just want me in prison. He wanted me silenced permanently. He was terrified I had kept backup copies of the real ledgers. Dominic felt a sudden, violent surge of protective rage, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Did you? Of course I did, she smiled, a lethal, triumphant expression. But that wasn't enough. SEC violations take years to prosecute. I needed something faster, something that would end him tonight. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until their bodies were flush. I didn't just run books for the Volkov Syndicate, Dominic. I used their servers to hack into Sterling Enterprises' offshore accounts. Richard took your 40 million. Your clean, legitimate money meant to stabilize his company, and he leveraged it. He's using your money to underwrite a massive, illegal arms shipment moving through the port of Newark next week. Dominic stopped dancing. The music continued around them, but the world had suddenly narrowed down to the woman in his arms. She had outplayed him. She hadn't just used his invitation for a grand entrance. She had used him as a Trojan horse to get into the same room as Richard Sterling while holding the trigger to a bomb that could destroy both their families. If the feds find out he's running guns with Costello money, it triggers a RICO case, Dominic said, his voice a lethal, vibrating wire. It brings my entire family down. Exactly, Genevieve said softly. Which is why we are going to fix it. Together. Before Dominic could respond, Genevieve pulled away from him, her eyes locking onto Richard Sterling, who was standing near the bar, looking pale and erratic. It's time, she said. Dominic followed her as she carved a path through the crowd, heading straight for Richard. Seeing them approach, Richard panicked, turning to flee. But Vincent, Dominic's massive underboss, suddenly materialized from the crowd, blocking the exit. Richard, Genevieve said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We need to talk. My feet are killing me. Shall we go back to the library? Trapped, Richard looked around wildly. No one was coming to his aid. Senator Hastings actively looked away. With trembling legs, Richard walked back down the corridor, followed closely by Dominic and Genevieve. Inside the library, Dominic locked the heavy oak door. Genevieve didn't sit. She walked over to the grand mahogany desk, reached into the small metallic clutch she carried, and pulled out a sleek, black USB drive. She dropped it onto the wood. It landed with a heavy, final thud. Aegis Holdings, Richard, Genevieve said, the temperature in the room plummeting. Richard gasped, his hands flying to his chest as if he had been shot. How? I tracked the routing numbers from Grand Cayman through Geneva, she continued, her voice taking on the rapid, precise cadence of the lethal CFO she used to be. I know about the shipments at the port of Newark. I know you used Dominic's $40 million as collateral. If I give this drive to District Attorney Kensington, who is currently eating your butter-poached lobster in the next room, you will be arrested before they cut the wedding cake. You wouldn't, Richard stammered, looking at Dominic. Costello, if she does that, your family goes down with me. Your money is tied to it. My money was legally transferred to Sterling Enterprises, Dominic said coldly, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms. I have the contracts to prove it was a legitimate loan. What you did with it afterward is on you. The feds might investigate me, but they will bury you under the jail. You tried to have me killed in Danbury, Genevieve said, stepping around the desk, cornering Richard like a predator with a wounded animal. You took my career, my name, and my freedom. Now, I am taking everything you have left. Richard fell to his knees, the great patriarch of New York society, weeping onto the Persian rug. Please, Genevieve, I'll give you the money back. I'll pay you double. Just don't give them the drive. I don't want your dirty money. Genevieve looked down at him with absolute disgust. Here is what is going to happen, Richard. Tomorrow morning, you are going to call an emergency board meeting. You are going to step down as CEO, citing severe, sudden health issues. You are going to sign over your controlling shares of Sterling Enterprises to your new son-in-law, Leo. Dominic's eyebrows shot up. This was the twist. She wasn't just destroying Richard. She was handing the entire Sterling empire to the Costello family. You're giving it to him? Richard choked out. Leo is clean. He's a lawyer. He can run the legitimate side of the business, Genevieve said. And more importantly, he answers to Dominic. The Costello family will own Sterling Enterprises by noon tomorrow. And what about you? Richard asked, tears streaming down his face. What do you get out of this? Genevieve looked at Dominic. The ice in her eyes had melted, replaced by a fierce, burning fire. I get my name back, she said. You are going to write a full confession regarding the embezzlement, clearing my name completely. You'll say you forced me to sign those documents under duress. If you do this, I will destroy the USB drive, and the feds never learn about the guns. Richard hung his head, sobbing openly. Okay, I'll do it. I'll sign it all over. Good, Genevieve said, picking up the USB drive and slipping it back into her clutch. She turned to Dominic. I believe our work here is done. Take me home, Dominic. Dominic unlocked the door, and held it open for her. As she walked past him, the scent of her perfume, jasmine, and gunpowder hit him. He had sought out a ghost to play a part, but he had found a queen who had just handed him an empire. The heavy oak doors of Oheka Castle closed behind them, muffling the jazz band and the frantic, suffocating energy of the Sterling wedding. The cool Long Island night air hit Genevieve, and for the first time since she had stepped out of the Baccarat hotel suite, she let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the high-stakes execution of her revenge was beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Dominic didn't say a word. He merely signaled to his security detail. Within seconds, the armored Maybach pulled up to the sweeping stone staircase. As they descended, the few lingering paparazzi snapped desperate photos, trying to capture the mob boss and the disgraced CFO, leaving before the cake was even cut. Dominic shielded her from the flashbulbs, his large hand resting protectively on the small of her back, guiding her into the dark, quiet sanctuary of the vehicle. Once the doors sealed shut, the silence between them was thick, charged with the aftershocks of a detonated bomb. The privacy partition separating them from the driver slid up with a soft hum. Genevieve leaned her head against the cool leather headrest, closing her eyes. She reached up and unclasped the heavy Cartier diamond necklace, letting it pool like liquid fire into her lap. "You played me," Dominic stated. His voice wasn't angry. It was a low, resonant purr, vibrating in the confined space of the Maybach. Genevieve opened her eyes and turned her head to look at him. "I utilized my available resources, Dominic. You wanted a weapon to terrify Richard Sterling. I merely ensured the weapon was fully loaded. You used my 40 million as leverage. You knew about the gun shipments through Newark before I even walked into that underground poker room to find you." "I did," she admitted softly, unapologetic. "The Volkovs are sloppy with their internal routing. I saw the Sterling accounts brushing against illicit offshore entities months ago, but I couldn't touch him. I was a pariah, a convicted felon. If I went to the FBI, they would have laughed me out of the building. I needed a battering ram to get back inside the castle. You, Dominic Costello, were my battering ram." Dominic shifted closer to her, the sheer physical gravity of the man demanding her full attention. "And what if Richard had called your bluff? What if he had let you hand that USB drive over to the district attorney?" A slow, wicked smile spread across Genevieve's face. She opened her metallic clutch, retrieved the black USB drive, and tossed it onto the center console. "He couldn't call my bluff, Dominic, because there was no bluff. The files on that drive are real. But the twist?" She leaned in, her gaze dropping to his lips before meeting his dark eyes again. "I already initiated a quiet transfer of his liquid offshore assets the moment the clock struck midnight. Even if he hadn't surrendered the company to Leo, Richard Sterling would have woken up completely bankrupt." Dominic stared at her, a profound realization settling over him. He had spent his life surrounded by ruthless men, killers, and sociopaths who took what they wanted with brute force. But the woman sitting beside him in a blood-red Alexander McQueen gown was infinitely more dangerous. She didn't break kneecaps. She dismantled entire financial empires with a keystroke. She was an apex predator disguised as high society. Suddenly, Dominic reached out, his hand wrapping around the nape of her neck. He pulled her flush against him. Genevieve gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to rest against the solid wall of his chest. "You are a terrifying woman, Genevieve Croft," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "Are you afraid of me, Dominic?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs, betrayed by the sudden, overwhelming proximity. "No," he breathed, right before his mouth crashed down on hers. The kiss was like a match striking a powder keg. All the restrained tension, the danger of the evening, and the undeniable, magnetic pull between them erupted. Genevieve's fingers tangled in his dark hair as Dominic pulled her onto his lap, his hands mapping the curve of her spine through the silk of her dress. It wasn't a gentle, romantic embrace. It was a collision of equals, a furious claiming between two people who understood the darkest, most ruthless corners of the world and found a perfect reflection in each other. By the time the Maybach pulled into the private underground garage of Dominic's Manhattan high-rise, The world had fundamentally shifted. The fallout the next morning was biblical. At 8 a.m. on Sunday, a press release hit the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg terminals worldwide. Richard Sterling, citing sudden and severe cardiac distress, was stepping down as CEO and chairman of the board of Sterling Enterprises, effective immediately. The release also announced that his new son-in-law, Leonardo Costello, would assume controlling interest to guide the family company through this difficult transition. Manhattan's financial district was sent into an absolute frenzy. But the true earthquake hit at 10 a.m. A high-powered attorney from Cravath, Swain and Moore, retained quietly by Dominic's holding company, walked into the Southern District of New York courthouse. He handed a sealed manila envelope directly to the federal prosecutor's office. Inside was a signed, notarized 60-page confession from Richard Sterling, detailing exactly how he had manipulated internal audits, forged signatures, and utilized illegal shell corporations to frame his former CFO. By Monday afternoon, a federal judge had issued an emergency injunction overturning Genevieve Croft's conviction. The court declared a gross miscarriage of justice, formally expunging her record. Leo Costello, still reeling from a honeymoon suite in Street Barts, called his brother in a state of absolute shock. "Dom, what the hell is going on? Richard just signed everything over to me. His lawyers are saying he's retiring to a private clinic in Switzerland. The board is looking to me for direction. I don't know how to run a global logistics empire." Dominic sat in his leather office chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Across the desk from him sat Genevieve, dressed in a sharp, immaculately tailored charcoal power suit, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek, professional chignon. She looked like a conqueror claiming her throne. "You don't have to run it alone, Leo," Dominic said smoothly into the phone. "I've arranged for a transition consultant, an executive partner who knows the company inside and out. She's going to help you restructure." "Who?" Leo asked. Desperate, Dominic smiled, meeting Genevieve's icy, triumphant gaze. "Genevieve Croft." There was a long silence on the line. "The woman from the wedding? Dom. Isn't she? Didn't she? She was framed, Leo. The news will be everywhere in an hour. She is the most brilliant financial mind in this city. You will listen to her, you will learn from her, and together, you are going to legitimize the Costello name. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Dom." Leo swallowed hard. "I understand." Dominic hung up the phone. He stood and walked around the desk, pouring 2 glasses of the expensive Macallan. He handed one to Genevieve. "To the new Empress of Manhattan," Dominic toasted, the crystal clinking softly in the quiet office. "And to the man who bought the dress," Genevieve replied, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking through her formidable armor. She took a sip, the amber liquid burning smoothly down her throat. "What happens now, Dominic? Your money is clean. The company is yours in all but name. Richard is a ghost. Now?" Dominic stepped closer, taking the glass from her hand and setting it on the desk next to his. He pulled her by the waist, pressing her against the edge of the mahogany desk. "Now, we run this city. Together." Genevieve wrapped her arms around his neck, the shadows of her past finally burned away by the fires of her own ambition. She had gone to hell and back, but she hadn't returned alone. She had returned with the devil himself, and heaven help anyone who stood in their way. The society pages called it a hostile corporate takeover. The underworld whispered it was a mafia masterstroke. Genevieve Croft walked into Ohika Castle, a disgraced ghost, and walked out an empress, her hand firmly resting in the grip of New York's most dangerous man. They were 2 sides of a lethal coin, one ruling the boardroom, the other commanding the streets bound forever by a ruined wedding and revenge flawlessly executed.